y'all, my name is Jennifer Huddleston Kelly, and I am an alcoholic. I've been kept sober since December 5th of 92, and that's my miracle. And I am so thankful to get to be with you guys tonight. This is so much fun. I know it's not like being in person, but it's just fun. I had an AA buddy, and he used to tell the story about how at his first group conscience, one guy hit another guy with a folding chair, and he was hooked. Like he never missed another group conscience. And I kind of feel that way about Zoom meetings. The first Zoom meeting I talked at, there was a woman walking around naked, and and it was just real exciting, because she didn't realize, she kept leaning over to the computer, and I'm going, and I've been hooked ever since. Like I get to check out what's going on, what your room looks like, what your cat looks like. I'm nosy anyway, so this is kind of delightful to me. As I said, I've been kept sober since December 5th of 92, and that's my miracle. And I did not, unlike most of y'all, I did not come into Alcoholics Anonymous with clean motives. I didn't even come in convinced I was an alcoholic. I just had a lot of bad luck. It seems that whenever about the 400th time I drive drunk, I get caught every 400th time. And so I had gotten a felony DWI, and an attorney that worked out of his garage, because those are the kind of attorneys I can afford. They do not have legal offices. They're almost as down on their luck as I am. And my attorney had told me that I was going to spend a year in jail. And I am not good at jail. I am good at a lot of things, like air conditioning and snacks, and I'm getting there with the ukulele, but I am terrible at jail because I am not tough in any way, shape, or form. My weapon of choice is projectile weeping and crazy, and I just didn't think that I could hang in jail. I really didn't, and so I came into Alcoholics Anonymous trying to make it look good for a judge, trying to make it look like it was my idea to go to AA so that she wouldn't make me spend that year in jail. And a terrible, wonderful thing happened. The very first night I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, I fell in love with you. It was not my bright idea, and I can remember sitting in that meeting thinking it was really weird that you people couldn't even remember your own names, that somebody always had to say, "Hi, Frank," so you wouldn't forget. And but the people in that meeting were kind to me, and kindness so often is how God shows up in my life. Because with that kindness, my mind opens just a little bitty bit. And those people were really nice to me, nice enough that when they told me to go to Denny's after the meeting, I went. And we'll get to that in a little bit, but I probably ought to tell you all the bad breaks I had before I got to you. I was born at a very early age on November 16th of 1966. And I was born to a football coach and an English teacher, and they're not drinkers. They were never drinkers. Drinking wasn't good or bad at my house. It just wasn't. And what my parents did was they went to work and they went to church and they did the right thing even when nobody was looking. They're those kind of people, like really boring. My parents met and they dated and they got married and they had sex in that order. And apparently that's a big deal in my family. It's supposed to go that way. And I know that because that's what my sister did too. She met a guy, they dated, they got married, and they had sex in that order. And I married Big Daddy 10 years ago, and I was not a virgin. So one of these things just does not belong here. And I've known that since the beginning. And if there's anybody new here, I always like to clarify, because when we tell our stories, we sometimes go back to people and places and situations. And when I was new, what I heard is, these are the reasons I'm an alcoholic. And these are not the reasons I'm an alcoholic. Alcohol is almost exclusively responsible for my alcoholism. It's really hard to make one without it. And so the reason that I'm an alcoholic is what happens when I put alcohol in my body. And it's explained in masterly detail in the doctor's opinion. And if you haven't read it with somebody who knows really what it means, you ought to try that out, because I was in AA for about a year before I did that. And it makes a big difference. So, but I tell about where I came from and those people and places and situations, because that's kind of how we connect. And until I connected with some things about you, and then the way that you drank, the way that you thought, and the way that you felt, I wasn't really interested in the solution that you had to offer, because I knew that the solution you had to offer was not drinking one day at a time. And that seemed a bit extreme. So I'm growing up in this family, and I'm happy and healthy and well-adjusted and loved for almost 3 whole years. And then they brought home my first resentment and my longest lasting one. And she's just not anything like me. I've already told you, she did some stuff different. And because of that, she believes differently than I do, and she votes differently than I do. And we live a very different lifestyle than each other. But I was just always twitchy. I was always this big feeling kid. And I didn't know what to do that. And other people knew that about me too. You know, when I was a little girl, my dad sat me down and said, "Jennifer, I think there are people who feel too much." And I thought, "Yes, sir. Now what? Like, what do we do with that?" And he had no solution to offer me except an observation that everybody was aware of. I was just incredibly sensitive. And at times that made me barely functional. And so a part of my coping skills was to learn how to be funny, so that it would look like I mean to be this way, and not that the voices in my head are just driving me nuts all day long. So I'm wandering through life, and I'm living from the outside in. That's kind of my skill, is that if you tell me I'm wonderful, I'm wonderful. And if you tell me I'm terrible, I'm terrible. But at least I'm not invisible, because that's my big fear, is that I am on my own. I am so incredibly boring and average that no one will ever know I existed. And so I do these frantic things so that you will know that I exist. My story begins with a boy, because I really like boys and I've always wanted one, except for this one little flannel phase I had. But anyway, I really like them. And but I scare the fish. I hit puberty in like 3rd grade, and boys discovered me in like 2007. So there's a really long, awkward period in my life where I'm chasing them and they're running. And so I'm in high school, and I really want a boyfriend. And I don't know, something about that being ridiculously over feeling. And I don't know. I was not as attractive to the guys as I wanted to be. But this guy moved to town, and he had a couple of things going for him. He didn't know me. That's a big plus. He had an accent, which I thought was really sexy. He was from Mississippi, and I don't get out much, so that's exotic to me. And he was preppy when preppy was the thing to be. And I was goth before goth even existed. Now, I was singing in the church choir on Sunday morning, but on Saturday night, I was at the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and I didn't have any clothes. I just had costumes, you know. I was one of those kind of girls. And but I wanted to be a minister when I grew up. And I met this guy, and I wanted what he had, and I was willing to go to almost any lengths to get it. And he found me fascinating too, and we began to date. And I wanted to keep him, because we hated the same people, and we were disillusioned about the same things. We both loved to shoplift, so I knew we had a future. And I got to figure out how to keep him forever and ever, because I love him like only a 16-year-old girl can. And what I come up with is that he's going to need to deflower me, because I knew that if we had sex, we'd have to get married. It's in the rules. And I mean, what could go wrong with this plan? And so I don't tell him that he's going to deflower me, because I've noticed when you tell a man a plan, he starts to change the plan. And I don't know what I'm doing, but I've seen a couple of Molly Ringwald movies. And so we go on this little date, and we do a little light shoplifting at the mall. And then we're headed off to someplace romantic like Chili's. And there was a an REO Speedwagon song or maybe some Lionel Richie rocking out. And that's when I decide I'm going to make my big move, you know? So I pull the car off and just preparing to pounce. And that's when he comes out of the closet and a pattern begins. That big girls and gay guys, that's not a myth. Anyway, and this was the 80s. It was not a fun time for a guy to be gay, especially not a guy from Mississippi. And I know that that was a really hard thing for him to talk about. And I was so selfish and self-centered that I acted like he was gay at me. You know, I took it very personally, and I did not react with any compassion at all. As a matter of fact, I spent the next 2 years trying to convince him he wasn't that gay. He is, like he still is. I checked, and it stuck. But I got mad at him, and I got mad at God, and I got drunk at them both. You know, if he wasn't going to be my introduction to sin, then I was going to try something else, because being a good girl didn't get me what I wanted. And I couldn't figure out why I would want to be on the God Squad if it didn't get you what you wanted. And so I drank. I figure if you're going to start drinking at resentment, start with God and work your way down. And that's what I did. I had become fascinated by drinking. My friends started drinking in middle school, but I was a little bit older, and middle school drinking was not attractive to me because it involves nose puking and being grounded forever. And that did not seem like something I wanted to do. But I had started running around with an older crowd, which seems to be a common theme among alcoholics. We like to think it's because we're so mature. I now know it's because I have little antennas and I can find the least mature person in the room to this day. Like, I know exactly where they are. They're my people. And so I was running around with these nerds. They were going to the community college and singing in the pop group at the church. And they were one alto short, and I happened to be an alto. And so I started singing in their nerd group. And after choir practice, they would go and drink frozen margaritas, which is how you know they're not alcoholic. I don't know an alcoholic in the world who drinks a frozen drink. But anyway, they would have these margaritas, and the nerds would change while they drank, because all of a sudden they could flirt and tell dirty jokes. And I was like, wait a minute, this is personality in a picture. And I am nothing but personality. And if we can enhance this, there will be no stopping me. And so I became fascinated with drinking. Google did not exist back then, and I'm a big researcher. And so I asked about 740 questions about drinking. And to shut me up, somebody gave me 2 bottles of wine and said, for the love of God, just drink it. And so I did, but I didn't do it right away. Because I knew I didn't want to get caught. And my parents were teachers. Like, they knew where the party was before I did. And so I had these 2 bottles of wine in the back of my dad's car, and I drove them around for a couple of weeks in the Texas heat, because there's nothing that's going to make wine that has never seen a grape taste better than rolling around in the back of a hot car for a while. And it was the night before a church trip, and I was spending the night at my friend Yolanda's house, and my friend Susie was there. And Yolanda was being no fun at all. She was fighting with her boyfriend on the phone, back when phones were on walls. And Susie and I were bored. And that's when I remembered the 2 bottles of wine. And so I asked Susie if she wanted to get drunk, and she did. Now, Susie was a teeny tiny little drill teamy girl. She's still my friend today, one of the nicest women I've ever met, but she's a Susie. You know what I'm saying? Like, she had the naturally curly, gorgeous blonde hair. She still does. It's just not even fair. She has huge these little tiny waist, can do the splits for no reason. Yay! You know, she's just one of those girls who automatically knows how to giggle. I still can't giggle. When girls like Susie say that they're cold, people immediately start, Jennifer, chop some wood, Susie's cold, you know? And I'm the kind of girl who's changing her own tire. I've always been that girl. Like, I'm out there, you know, schlepping my own boxes and doing my own stuff. And I am so envious of girls like Susie. And it's not until years later when I'm sitting in Alcoholics Anonymous and I'm working the steps with a sponsor that I learned that the reason that nobody ever helped me change a tire was I never asked them. I was creating my own reality with my beliefs. I believed that no one would ever help me, so I never allowed it. I believed that no one would ever open the door for me, so I came slamming my way in without ever giving anyone the opportunity to. And I don't know that. I don't know that what I believe about Susie is completely made up. I have more friends and am doing more stuff than she ever did. She was a very lonely girl. But all I could see was that pretty blonde hair and that teeny tiny waist. And I want to beat Susie at drinking. Drinking was a competitive sport from the beginning for me. And so we started out closet drinkers. We sat on the floor of a closet and we got drunk. And I was way better at drinking than Susie. Like, I haven't had a drink in 27 years, and I still think I'm better at drinking than Susie. Because Susie's one of those 2 beers, I'm giggling, I got to go home kind of drinkers. It's pathetic. But that night, we laughed and we talked and we wet our pants and we puked, and it was glorious. It was glorious. It was the best night of my life. Now, if you talk to Susie about that night, she will tell you the weirdest story. Like, because I've asked her about it, and she talks about broken glass and blood and urine and vomit, just a lot of DNA. And I'm not saying that those things didn't happen. I'm just saying, why would you focus on that part? It's just a really negative way to look at what was mostly a magical evening, you know? And I now know it's because we had a completely different experience. You know, Susie had some drinks and she got sick and she came to the next morning and did not feel well. And I had some drinks, was transformed into a magical wonderland in which I start drinking and Susie's up here and I'm down here. At the end of one bottle of wine, we are neck and neck. And she dropped out of drinking, and by the time we were done, I could take her at anything. I mean, that's what alcohol does for me. It changes my perception completely. I moved from down here to way up here just with a cheap bottle of wine. Why wouldn't you drink if it did that for you? You know? Now that next morning, it was a totally different story. I came to and it tasted like a hamster had slept in my mouth. Do y'all remember that? Like your tongue grows hair while you're sleeping. I had never been that thirsty. I drank a couple of gallons of water because I didn't know anything about wine, and I went downstairs and my stomach had turned into a lava lamp. We were at a Hispanic girl's house and her mother had made huevos rancheros, and so I puked again. And then I got on a bus to sing for Jesus. And I was both of those things, and I loved both of those things. And my book tells me right here I could quit if I wanted to. But why? Why? I'm having more fun than I've ever had in my life. Because what I don't know is that drinking takes me out of me for just a little tiny while. And it turns down the volume on this all Jennifer radio that plays constantly, so that I can just be free, so that I can laugh, so that I can flirt, so that I can dance, so that I can giggle. Because for some reason, without it, I'm so locked up in fear and self that I don't know how to do those things. And so, of course, I drank. And that's where my drinking career began. And I'm just going to kind of try and fast forward to where it ended. By the end of my drinking, there were jobs and no jobs, men and no men, utilities and no utilities. I went from being this party girl on the weekends to somebody who got drunk every single day, whether she wanted to or not. I had started out my drinking wanting to be a minister. By the end, we had gone a ways off of that path. I alternated between 2 jobs. For a little while, I would be a preschool teacher. But the problem with that was that they get a little rigid about mourning and wanting you to be there every day, fully dressed and ready to function. And I can't exactly tell you whether I'm going to be up for morning. And so when the walls would start closing in on me there, I would quit and I would go work at a bar, usually a pool hall kind of place, something fancy, you know. And because I found that I had some transferable skills. Drunks and 4-year-olds are pretty much the same thing. And so once you know how to negotiate with one group of terrorists, you can usually negotiate pretty well with the other group. And in all honesty, the refreshments were better at the bar. But because the bar had no limits, you know, I was drinking kind of round the clock. When that would start to kind of close in on me, I'd go back to the daycare. And I just flip-flop between these two jobs. And I was always broke. I was always looking to a guy to rescue me. I just knew in my heart of hearts that if I could find somebody to marry me and to have a baby with, then I just knew everything would be different. And I don't know where I thought I was going to get that superpower, you know, that if I could get married and if I could get pregnant, then I would just stop. Because I drank with women who brought their baby carriers and set them down on the pool table. You know, those were my friends. And yet I truly believe that if I could just find the kind of love I needed, I wouldn't be drinking the way that I was drinking. And that just never panned out because I don't know, I'm the bottomless pit of emotional need. And apparently that's not that attractive. I use people up. I wear them out and I use them up, and gradually things get worse. You know, I start collecting DWIs. As I said, it's a hobby of mine. I got one, and then less than 6 months later, I got a second one, which I thought was really weird because I had a really good plan after I got that first DWI. I was going to be more careful. Now, this is the kind of plan that Al-Anons see right through. Like, they can see the hole in that. To alcoholics, it seems like a pretty solid plan. It's not until I'm years sober that I see the problem with the plan. You see, I drink so that I don't have to care about anything. So I'm drinking the no care juice. And then I decide I'll be more careful. And so I get that second DWI, and the state of Texas is pretty annoyed with me. Because I haven't been convicted of my first one, and I got my second one. And so I knew that I needed to do something about this. I needed to solve my driving problem. And because it's driving while intoxicated, clearly they put the most important word first. And if I can just clear up my driving problem solved. And so what I come up with is I'm going to move next door to my favorite bar. And then I could just stagger home. It seems like it would work. But what I don't know is that I'm suffering from a progressive, fatal obsession of the mind and allergy of the body. That I am struggling with alcoholism, which always gets worse, never better. And that I'm bringing it absolutely everywhere I go. And no amount of will is ever going to keep me from taking a drink, but I don't know that. And so I keep changing things around on the outside of me, not realizing that the problem's on the inside of me. One of my solutions was to try and get married. And I say I've been engaged 7 times, but never married. But I mean, I'm supposed to be honest. Just because I think of it as an engagement doesn't necessarily mean that he was serious. You know, I count it. If a guy in a blackout says, you know, I ought to marry you, I start practicing calligraphy. I don't require him to go to Zales or anything. But I have this problem with doing things in order. I kept having the divorces before the weddings. And one of the things we discovered on my inventory was that men who live with me wind up in the armed services. And I found that very curious because it is not that I date particularly patriotic men. It's that after living with me, they want to get away, you know? Um, and if you're going to get screamed at every day, you should at least be paid for it. And so this last guy that I got engaged to, like, that was really an engagement. Like, there was a ring and a dress and napkins with their names on it and stuff. He had gone in the Navy to get away from me, and I had forgotten what a jerk he was, and he forgot what a jerk I was. We kind of drank the same, and he had an alcoholic mother, so he had some training with this kind of insanity. But he kept getting thrown in the brig, and I kept forgetting to be faithful. I wasn't promiscuous. I just slept with a lot of people, you know? Somehow I think it sounds better if I say, oh, it wasn't a lust thing. It was more transactional than that. But it doesn't sound better. And it just occurred to me that my mother may be able to hear this talk. But whatever. Okay, we're just going to move on. And so anyway, the wedding doesn't happen. And I moved back home with my parents because the wheels are falling off. You know, I can't duct tape my life together anymore. And yet I'm still so arrogant that I think that they don't know. And I tell myself those stories like I'm not hurting anybody but myself. And gradually things are still getting worse. I'm living in East Plano, and I'm drinking 3 towns away because that's where my home bar was. And I would go there every day after work, and I would drive through 3 counties to get home. And November 19th of 1992, it was a couple of days after my 26th birthday, I got pulled over on a felony DWI. And it wasn't the most trouble I'd ever been in, and it wasn't the most afraid I'd ever been. But for some reason that night I was nearing the end of the road. And I know it because I told the truth, which surprised me. I've been a liar a lot longer than I've been a drunk. Like, I am an accomplished liar. And when that cop pulled me over and asked me how much I had to drink without even thinking, I said, everybody knows what you're supposed to say. You were supposed to say a couple. And what I said was $67 worth. Like, I didn't know how many drinks I had. I knew how much my tab was. And I just blurted it out. And then we played Let's Make a Deal. And I said, hey, you know I'm drunk and I know I'm drunk. So how about we do that pen thing and you just take me to jail? And he thought that was a great idea. I was his most agreeable customer that night. And he locked me up. And I had a moment of clarity sitting in a jail cell. And that moment of grace was that I could no longer tell myself the story that it was, you know, what's a nice girl like me doing in a place like this? I could no longer pretend that there were rational and logical reasons why I was doing the stuff that I was doing, because I didn't have any excuses for why I was doing the stuff that I was doing. In that moment, I knew that I get DWIs because I drink, and I drink because I don't know how to get through the day without drinking. And I am beyond the point where I can promise myself, God, or anybody else that I'm not going to do it again, because I know that I will. I know that I will. And so I said a prayer and I asked God for help, and I made a decision to go to Alcoholics Anonymous. And I meant that as earnestly as anything I've ever meant. And then they let me out of jail. And I made a really bad mistake. I didn't go straight to AA. I waited. I thought about it. And the longer I thought about it, the worse that idea sounded. And so I got drunk one more time. It's a long, convoluted story, but I was driving around an AA group trying to make myself go in. And I didn't have the courage to walk inside. And I don't know why. I don't know what I thought you were going to do. But I would go to nearby parking lots and sit in the parking lot and cry and practice saying, my name is Jennifer and I'm an alcoholic, you know, just awful, just blubbering. And I would just sit there and think about, oh my God, I'm so dramatic. I would listen to Patsy Cline's greatest hits. and just weep about how sad my life, how it's all over because I have to go to AA, and oh, it's just all over. It's all over. And one night I accidentally wound up at the group at meeting time, which was an oversight on my part. And so I start to get out of the car to go to the meeting, but I got that alkalogic. And the alkalogic says, wait a minute, you can't be rolling up into an AA meeting without an AA book. And so I left the meeting where the AA books live to go on a quest to find a big book. I wind up at Barnes and Noble, and they've got big books there, but they're really expensive. Like I don't know, this was 92. They were probably $5. And I was not that optimistic about AA. And so I left that place and I went to the half price books, and they've got AA books there. But the problem with the ones at the half price books is the willy-nilly highlighting, usually about the first 27 pages. They're clearly treatment big books. You know, they got highlighting in the first 27 pages, and I can't let some loser who sold their book to half price books influence my opinions about Alcoholics Anonymous with his willy-nilly highlighting. And so 3 days and several half price books later, I find a clean copy of the book, which is important for my studies. And I begin to read the book by myself. And that's when I got drunk. Because it seemed like there was no good news in that book at all. I mean, I know they're saying there's a great fact and, you know, whatever. But to me, it seemed like there was a lot of focus on this not drinking idea. And the longer I went without drinking, the worse that idea sounded. As a matter of fact, the less possible that idea sounded. And so I would imagine myself going to the meeting. I just couldn't quite go to the meeting. And so while I'm reading the big book by myself, I start thinking about, you know, if I go to AA, those people are nice. I had visited you once or twice before, just kind of checking things out. And I knew that if I showed up, you would try and help me. And I just did not want to waste your time, because I'm thoughtful like that. You know, I didn't want you investing in me if I wasn't really going to stay. And so I started thinking about this guy that I knew who had 8 DWIs, and he was still drinking at the bar. And my crummy attorney, I've only got 3, and he's told me I'm going to do a year in jail. And I start thinking, I need to talk to Jimmy. Jimmy seems like a man with a real answer, because he's still drinking. And my attorney's telling me sober might be a good idea. And so I decide I'm going to go talk to Jimmy and see what the Jimmy plan is. And if that doesn't work out, I can just hustle back over to AA. And so that's what I do. I go sit at a bar with my legal advisor, Jimmy the criminal, and I'm not going to drink, by the way. Here's some alkalogic. I'm going to go to a bar to meet with a criminal to get some legal advice, and I'm not going to drink. What could go wrong here? And so I sit across from what I think is the worst drunk I've ever met. He is not. I've been in AA a while. I've met some worse drunks now. And I begin to tell him about what's going on with me. And he says, oh, Jen, honey, I can afford to be the kind of drunk I am, but you can't afford to be the kind of drunk you are. And when the worst drunk you know starts talking down to you a little bit, you're having a real bad day. Like, oh, God, matter and matter. I can't pass college algebra, but I can figure out 8 is way more than 3. And this guy seems to think that I need some help. And yet there's this little voice inside of me that says, who would know better than Jimmy? Who would know better than Jimmy? And I knew he knew. I wanted to kick him right in the baby maker, but I knew he knew. I knew he knew how I thought and how I felt and how I drank. And Jimmy seemed to think that this might be an opportunity for me to find a way out. The other thing that happened that night, and it's probably as important, if not more important than what Jimmy told me, was that at some point there were drinks in front of me, and at some point I drank them. And I don't remember anything until I looked down and the glasses were empty. And I knew how dangerous it was for me to drink and drive after I was in all this trouble. And yet I drank, and I don't remember making that decision because I don't have to decide to drink. I am without defense. Alcohol has always been bigger than me and stronger than me and more powerful than me, and I don't know it. But that night, I was completely aware that I drank against my will, and I knew that I would do it again unless something huge changed in my life. And so I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, and I walked into a late meeting of the Plano group of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I sat where the newcomer loves to sit, as close to the door as humanly possible. I had made a deal with God in the parking lot that I would stay for one meeting, and if I heard something I could hang on to, I would go to one more. And that was it. That was all I could say, and I didn't really think I could keep that promise. That's why I sat by the door. Because at some point during that meeting, I knew that little voice in my head was going to say, we got to go, beep, beep. And I didn't want to be tripping over anybody trying to get out of there. And they turned out the lights and they lit the candles, and I knew I was in a cult, but it didn't matter because I had nowhere else to go. And right before the meeting began, everybody was sitting at the other end of the room, just in a circle, and somebody said, hey, why don't you come sit with us? There's an empty chair right here. And I really began to believe that my recovery began when I got up from that seat by the door and then moved to a chair that was suggested to me by one of the members of Alcoholics Anonymous. Because I've come to believe that I am always in better hands when I am listening to another alcoholic's ideas instead of my own. And I joined the circle of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I have not had a drink since. Now, I've had to do a couple of things to keep that chair, but I believe it began when I became a part of the circle of Alcoholics Anonymous. And those people began to share with me, and they were so kind. They were so excited to see me. And it felt like, like they had been waiting. And like, we can start, she's here. And I believe that's kind of what good members of Alcoholics Anonymous do. I think that's why we show up. We're waiting for that new twitchy chick who's sitting as close to the door as humanly possible, because they remind us of where we came from. They remind us of what it was like, and they show us what can happen if you can go from that to this. Something huge has happened. And I didn't know that God was showing up through your kindness. I'm trying to listen to the words that you're saying, and I'm listening for some secret that's going to keep me sober, and I'm not hearing it. Bless your hearts. We get so excited when there's a newbie in the room that we kind of forget they don't know what we're talking about. They don't know what a sponsor is or a big book or whatever else. They don't know what the phenomenon of craving is, and I don't know what they're saying. And the parts that I do understand, I'm not that crazy about. Like, there were people who would just smile at me so maniacally, and they would say, you're the most important person here. And I love that part. But then they'd follow it up with, because you remind us of where we never want to be again. And I would think, that's rude. I'm having a real bad day, y'all. And but finally, this guy began to share, and he had bib overalls on. I'm a big fan of bib overalls, and had a long beard. And I at least believed that guy used to drink. I looked at the rest of you. You were way too clean and shiny. You looked like you drank juice or milk. And but this guy, I could tell this guy had had a drink or two. And what he said was, I didn't know I was an alcoholic. I just thought I was thirsty. And it was the first thing in the whole meeting I could relate to. But then he said, and the more I drink, the thirstier I get. And that begins with the very first drink. The more I drink, the thirstier I get. That begins with the very first drink. And that guy solved a mystery that I had been working on for 10 years of bar drinking. I'd been trying to figure out why people who I knew were not as smart as me could walk into a bar, have a drink, maybe two. They'd have a kamikaze on their birthday. They would look at their watch. The watch would say, go home, and they would go home. And I know because I followed some of them, And I couldn't do that. And I thought I had a change in my mind problem. But Jean explained that it was something that happens in my body. I get thirstier with every drink. Nothing is ever quenched with alcohol for an alcoholic. I will always drink like a car with no brakes. I'll drink till I run out of something or till I run into something. And I knew what this guy was talking about because I'd been living it night after night after night. And he explained what happened to him was that he got a spiritual advisor. We call them sponsors. The sponsor helped him take 12 spiritual principles and apply them in his life. We call those the steps. And he said somewhere in the midst of taking these steps, he developed a relationship with a higher power that he called God. And he said once he got that relationship with God, he didn't have to pick up that first drink, and he hadn't been thirsty in a real long time. And I believed him. And I wanted what that guy had. And at the end of the meeting, I began to share because they asked me if I wanted to, and I haven't shut up since. And everybody in the room seemed to be an alcoholic into this and an alcoholic into that. And I didn't think I was an ANDA. I only knew of one other 12-step program. I now qualify for probably 15. But at that time, I only knew of one other one. And while I had certainly done some other things, I had a DEA agent show up at my apartment at one point because I was running around with some manufacturers and distributors, and I'm thrifty. And these DEA agents showed up and they explained who they were, and they explained that they were watching those people, and that if I continued to hang out with those people, I would go to prison with them. And I was clean in 24 hours. I did not need a stiff metal chair, an inventory, a sponsor, a meeting, nothing. I was done. It felt like I was just done. I never touched that stuff again. It felt like I put on about 100 pounds in 72 hours because I would eat and black out. But I don't know, for whatever reason, I could just walk away from that. But drinking just wasn't the same thing for me. And so I want to fit in, and yet I'm not an ANDA. And so when I introduced myself for the first time in AA, I said, my name is Jennifer, and I'm an alcoholic and a thief, a whore, and a liar. I did not know that once you said alcoholic, you've pretty much got the rest of that covered. You do not need to be that specific. But I told him a little bit about how I'd been dying one day at a time and some of the things that I was ashamed of. And I told him the thing I was most ashamed of was that I knew I could never get or stay sober by myself. And those tacky people smiled and nodded. I thought they should at least weep with me. I'd read the book. This is not good news. And yet they smiled and nodded, because you can fool the fans in AA, but you can't fool the players. And that night I was just desperate enough to be a player in Alcoholics Anonymous because I was fresh out of ideas. And so when they gave me the desire chip and they gave me the phone list and they gave me my little packet of pamphlets, they told me to go to Denny's, and I went. I used to say they asked me to go to Denny's, but now I believe they told me to, because you don't ask a newbie to do anything because our brains are eating our faces off. I think if you had asked me to go, I would have said, oh my gosh, I've got the board meeting in the morning. I would have made up something ridiculous because I didn't know what you were going to do to me. But when you told me to go to Denny's, I went. And it's one of the few things I remember very clearly about that night. I was driving over to the Denny's thinking, this must be where you fill out the paperwork to join Alcoholics Anonymous. And while I did not fill out any paperwork that night, I do think it was AA orientation, because I learned that you guys laugh at things that are not funny. You share things you should not share, especially not in public. And I don't know why they call us anonymous, because you have no volume control and you say stuff like, isn't that just like an alcoholic? And you just laugh hysterically. And I don't know that if you're at Denny's at 2 a.m, you're either a member of AA or a future member of AA, but there was something so attractive about the way that you guys all got along. It's exactly what I saw when this meeting began. Everybody's talking and nobody's listening, and it's awesome. And what I saw that night was what I see in meetings all around the country today. A fellowship of friendliness and an understanding that is indescribably wonderful. And it was so attractive that I went home and I prayed to a God that I knew had given up on me a long time ago, and I asked for his help. And I continued to talk to that God, and I continued to show up at those meetings. And just because I fell in love with you, I did what you told me to do. You know, I got a sponsor and I got a big book and I took some steps. And I surrendered a tiny bit at a time, just a tiny bit at a time. I gave up my alcoholism to the group, and I did what you told me to do, and I didn't drink. But the rest of my life, I surrendered little by slow. When I got sober, I was a preschool teacher. I couldn't switch jobs because I had that felony and they were going to find out about it. But God knew where I needed to be when I was new and crazy, watching my behavior in 4-year-olds. And there was a little boy in my class, and he had this nasty blanket. You know how little kids get attached to stuff, and it's kind of gross, and their moms want it gone, but they can't let it go. And this kid's mom was a genius, because she said, "Can you give it up 1 inch at a time?" And every morning they would have this every Monday morning they would have this ceremony, and they would cut off 1 inch of the blanket, and he could have the rest of it. And little by little, 1 inch at a time.
I'm sorry.
Oh, he surrendered that. He surrendered that blanket, and that's kind of what my journey in Alcoholics Anonymous has been. 1 inch at a time, I've given something up as God has gotten bigger in my life. 1 inch at a time, I've surrendered something as God has gotten bigger. And every single time, what I've given to God has been returned to me in a better, bigger, more amazing way. But I never believe it's going to be that way. All I ever think is, I'm just going to be left with nothing. I will be the hole in the donut. You know, that whole thing. We never think my life could be better. If I will just let go of control, my life could be better. And that's what's continued to happen. I work the steps over and over and over again, and my life just keeps getting better. And here's where I want to stop talking, and yet I have one more part of my story that I really have to tell. When I was about 14 years sober, I fell in love with the sweetest man I've ever met. I went to high school with him, but he was a nice guy. You know, he was a nice guy. He was in the orchestra. I was way too cool for that. And we actually went on 2 dates, and bless his heart, I just knew I could steamroll right over him. And so I ran as fast as I could. And but right around the time I turned 40, he showed back up in my life on social media, and he asked me on a date, and he was living in Colorado, and he flew to Texas to take me to dinner. And I was dating guys who lived in Oxford houses and sleeping in race car beds. I do love me a fixer-upper. And so having a guy who was capable of buying a plane ticket seemed like a pretty big deal, you know, and he courted me, and it was a really neat time in my life. And I kind of got busy being in love, and I kind of forgot to talk to my sponsor. And she and I had a little situation where I felt like she had betrayed something. I now know that it was a pretty big misunderstanding, but at the time, I felt like she had betrayed my trust, and she had told somebody something that I hadn't given her permission to share. And it doesn't matter what she did. What I did was I had a 14-year relationship with this woman, and I never said a word about it. I just stuffed it down and locked it up and thought, it's not a big deal. I'm a happy person. I'm in this great place in my life. I don't need to worry about it. I'm just going to ignore it and it'll go away. And that's not what happened. I kept slowly backing away. I wasn't calling her as much. I wasn't talking to her about what was going on with me. I wasn't sharing about what was happening with sponsees. Because I was unsponsored, some things began to happen with some sponsees, and I wasn't running it past anybody that was objective. And suddenly being a sponsor didn't seem like a really good idea, because some women got really angry with me, and I felt attacked, and I felt betrayed, and I didn't have anybody who was talking sense to me. And so I'm going to meetings, but I'm running out so that nobody will ask me to sponsor them. I'm putting up this barbed wire. And And I'm sort of sliding out of AA, but I'm doing it so gradually that I don't even notice it. And yet I am getting invited to talk places out of town, and I'm one of my favorite speakers. And so I'll go almost anywhere to hear me give a talk. And so I would go to these things and I would give a funny little talk. But the problem is that they don't end on Friday nights. And somewhere during the weekend, I would hear somebody talk about, me and the fellers I sponsor, we go to the lake and we study the literature of Alcoholics Anonymous. And it would make me so uncomfortable as some guy would start talking about that stuff. Back of my neck would get hot, and I would just think, Scooter, you need to wrap it up. We got an ice cream social going, because he's making me really uncomfortable. And I would think, I need to do that. I really need to do that. And I'd go home and think about it. And then I'd give another funny little Friday night talk. And at some point during the weekend, some really nice put together lady would say, every Tuesday night, me and the ladies I sponsor, we study the literature of Alcoholics Anonymous, and we're rocketed into the fourth dimension of blah, 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 blah. And I'm just thinking, come on, Trixie, we got to go, because she's making me really uncomfortable. And eventually I get backed into a corner because I'm not all the way in and I'm not all the way out, and I'm not very happy. And living a lie in Alcoholics Anonymous is a real uncomfortable thing. But my God works right on time, and a sponsee got a sponsee, and she didn't know what to do with her. And I got really annoyed that I'm sponsoring this woman by proxy, and just in anger and arrogance, I say, you know what I'm thinking about doing? I'm thinking about starting a step study. And I had no intention of starting a step study, none. And she said, yay, let's do that. And I said, no, wait a minute, slow your roll there. And I said I was going to work out the logistics, but I wasn't. And she went off and told 2 other women that I sponsored that I was starting a step study. And then my pride and ego got involved. And so I started a step study. And I knew what was going to happen. We were going to show up 1 week or maybe 2, and then they'd start flaking out and I could be done. And when I say done, I meant done with AA. I was too arrogant to think I would drink, but I thought I would probably be done with AA if this didn't work out. But God works right on time, because I showed up. We had the big book study at Starbucks because I wasn't going to dust. And I showed up that very first week, and there were these women sitting around the table, and they had brand new 12 and 12s, and they had highlighters, and they were so excited. They were starving to death for the solution that we offer in Alcoholics Anonymous. And they took it seriously, and my life began to change. They took it seriously, and I got fed. They took it seriously, and I said the 3rd step prayer, and I called Cindy M and said, I need you to be my sponsor. And I left the most ridiculous message. In my head, I was going to say, if you have a chance, could we chat? And instead, I did this gibberish, and then forgot to tell her my name and where I live. But anyway, I got a new sponsor. And I fell back in love with Alcoholics Anonymous because I began to participate fully in Alcoholics Anonymous, sitting knee to knee, reading the literature and watching women's lives change. This stuff gets real boring if you're not doing the cool part. And when I started doing the cool part, I couldn't get enough, and I still can't. Each day recovery begins with one alcoholic sharing with another experience, strength, and hope. The book just never tells us which one of us it begins for. Ideally, it begins for both of us. But I know that I want it to begin for me, which means I got to sit still, and I got to open that book, and I got to be passing it along so that I can keep it. I'm glad to be here, and it's a good day to be sober.
Jennifer, thank you so much. That was awesome. I love you, and I'm